In the 4th and 5th grade, I spent the night at my friend Tom's house almost every weekend. Tom lived in a rundown farmhouse in the country. He shared a room with his older brother, Walter. The three of us would stay up late telling scary stories. The scariest was a true story. But this is how Walter told it. Now, back in the 1920s, this house was owned by a different family. Their closest neighbor was the inbred moonshiner named Pete. He lived in a shack deep in the woods and was frequently in trouble with the law. The parents warned the little boy and the girl who lived here never to go near Pete's land. The young boy lived in this very room. And one night that he was awakened by the sound of shattered glass somewhere inside the house. Living so close to Pete, the boy was very cautious, and instead of opening the door, he locked it. He pressed his ear to the door and listened. The boy heard footsteps stumbling down the hallway that were much too heavy to be his father's. He could almost smell moonshine through the bedroom door. "Let me in there, boy." It was Pete, but the boy wouldn't unlock the door. Overcome by his fear, he shouted, "No!" And after a minute, the boy could hear Pete's heavy bootsteps fading back through the house. In a distant room, he heard his father shouting at Pete, but the shouts soon turned to screams. For almost an hour, the sounds degenerated as the father shed his vocal cords to ribbons while screaming. The boy thought the pleading and hoarse agony was the worst thing he had ever heard until he was replaced by something worse. Silence. Pete's bootsteps lumbered back through the house to the boy's room, and he pounded on the solid oak door. "Hey, boy, open up this door or you'll regret it." The boy could smell the moonshine through the door, and again he said no. And so it was his mother's turn. Her shouts and screams lasted for about 2 hours. When they stopped, the heavy boots stumbled back to his door, and this time the stink of the moonshine, it was overwhelming. "Boy, I said, open up this door. It's your last chance now." And that boy, he was terrified, but he said, "Please don't hurt my sister." But Pete was drunk and he was enjoying himself, and he chuckled. "Open up then, boy." But the boy knew better. So he spent the next 3 hours listening to the screams of his younger sister. And when the police came to investigate the heist 2 days later, they found his mom, dad, and sister tied spread eagle to their beds. Pete had cut a small hole in each of their lower abdomens, pulled the bowels out to their bellies inch by inch as they died in pain. They found the boy dehydrated but alive. He was still locked in this very room, pressed against this very door. He was completely catatonic. He spent the rest of his life in a sanitarium, occasionally mumbling, "Should I have opened the door? Should I have opened the door?" Pete was eventually caught and executed. His shack was torn down, but his ghost still haunts the house. Sometimes we can smell the hint of sweet moonshine in the morning, and pain in our bellies. When we do, we know Pete was here during the night, trying to pull out our insides. This story really creeped me out. Like 10 out of 10. I always insisted that the three of us sleep with the bedroom door locked and the lights on. Your imagination is so strong at that age. I was terrified of every noise in the house before finally falling asleep. Whenever I woke up in their house, I could even smell the faint, sweet aroma of Pete's moonshine. And to be honest, I could usually feel a pain in my lower belly. Whenever I told the two brothers about it, they would giggle and play along. "Yeah, I smell it too," said Walter. "Yeah, me too. My stomach hurts," chimed in Tom, pretending to be scared. Then they moved to Utah when Tom and I were in the 5th grade, and I haven't seen them since. Flash forward to this morning, and I'm sitting in chemistry lab on campus. And as we were setting up for the experiment, one of the chemicals smelled exactly the same as my memory of Pete's moonshine. It's an incredibly distinct, penetrating, almost sweet scent. Not exactly like hard alcohol or real moonshine, but similar. I had not smelled it since those mornings after sleeping over at Tom and Walter's. This was the exact same smell. And I picked up the bottle and I looked at the label. Diethyl ether? It was ether. I stared across the lab in a daze. Frozen. I remembered locking the door of their bedroom every night. I thought about waking up with the faint smell of ether in my mouth. And I remembered the distinct pain in my bowels each morning. And then I realized there was no Pete the Moonshiner. They had been assaulting me. About a month or two ago, I picked up a job at a local seaside aquarium. And it's nothing special, just a minimum wage job, mopping up the floors and cleaning up the glass so that way everything will be clean when morning comes. Work starts at 2 p.m. And there's a lot of ground to cover, but the task is mundane enough that getting overstressed isn't an issue. No, it's not the work that frays my nerves. It's what's in the tanks. 2 people work the night shift. Jared, a kid straight out of high school, and me. We usually start at the entrance, then split up from there. He takes garbage duty with all the outside pens, and I take the inside complex solo till he finishes up enough to help me. He's a nice enough guy, shy around girls. I couldn't barely get a word out of him when we first met, but his work skills make up for his muteness. And together, we were the night crew, and between us I thought everything would be alright. Things changed a month in. That's when I started noticing the puddles that kept appearing in rooms that I've yet to mop, places that I've yet to step. They would make trails around the floor tiles, like something was flopping around like a fish out of water. And I'd check the tanks, and with no leaks or cracks, they'd all be in order. And after a few days of this, Jared and I would ask our boss about it, see if maybe one of the pipes busted or it was a leak through the floor. But she assured us that that couldn't be the case. She also said that all of the pipes and the systems, including the water tank, were all maintained ever since that certain incident happened a few years back. We had to trust her because we both knew what she was talking about. As much as the aquarium tries to deny it, us locals will never forget about 10 years ago when one of the workers shoved his screaming daughter into one of the maintenance tanks that were being used to water levels between pools, jammed her in there till she was a contorted mess to let the salt water choke her out and rot her bones. Strangely, no body was actually found, just floating pieces of flesh in a waterlogged dress. "We take better precautions now," my boss simply told me, then ushered us on our way. Despite all her assurances, it didn't stop the water from building up in most random places. And in the days to follow, my annoyance slowly turned to a rising dread as I began to notice that the puddles were beginning to follow me, like wet footsteps shadowing my own. Those thoughts were beginning to get me, especially as the puddles kept getting closer and closer to me each night that went by. It gets to the point where I have Jared with me at all times, because they seemed to keep their distance whenever he was around. Not to say that I felt a bit embarrassed asking him to escort, but I could see it in his eyes that he was beginning to think that I was a little paranoid. And paranoid was something that I didn't want to be. So, as an attempt to calm my nerves, I would bring my iPod with me, plug it into my ears, and let the music be my company as I mopped dark hallways full of half-lit tanks and the flickering shadows of the creatures that inhabited them. The turning point happened that night when we were walking through the tube, made entirely out of glass and going straight through a massive shark tank. It was one of the main attractions. There aren't any lights in the tube, so we had to bring our own. And I remember how I would wave my flashlight away whenever I saw a shark, as if that was the scariest thing that I would see that night. My headphones were on, an old 60s ballad serenading my ears when I noticed it. a second set of words singing underneath the lyrics, something that I had never heard before. It was enough to make me stop and listen to the eerie, echoing second chorus. It wasn't until Jared flipped off my headphones that I realized that the voice wasn't coming from my iPod. I can't remember what I was thinking right then. Maybe I was too scared to think at all. I knew something was right behind me, something making my mind scream at me to keep walking till I was out of there and safe at home. But I turned around anyway. A wall of black made up the entrance of the tube, my flashlight too far away to pierce it. The high-pitched, animalistic wail slowly choked out, and then nothing. And Jared and I looked at each other, and I could tell that he was almost as pale as I was. And we were both drowning in the silence. Someone had to make a decision and do it fast before we both lost our minds. A minute passed, and then... Don't worry. I'll go check it out, Jared said, more words to me than he had ever uttered through our entire janitorial career together. How about we just keep moving? That side is clean. No need to go back there, I replied, sounding more frightened than I wanted to. I know how much you hate the dark, so you can stay put. It'll be all right, was all he said before he vanished into the shadows, leaving me with nothing but a flashlight and 2 mop buckets. So I stood there in the tube, enduring the longest 30 minutes of my life. The sharks lazily swam around me, sometimes brushing up against the glass and causing me to jump. It was like they were watching me, waiting for something to happen. A little past a half hour, I heard it. The telltale drip of water cascading off of a wet body and onto the floor. Something was at the end of the hallway, standing right at the edge of the shadows. I couldn't see it, but I knew that it was there, just standing there as a puddle formed beneath it, looking at me. My brain did the first thing that I could think of. I raised the flashlight like a weapon. Hello? It moved fast. All I saw was a pale blur before pain erupted in my chest. I screamed as I fell back, the flashlight clattering away from me. My head cracked on the mop buckets, spilling dirty suds across the glass. Whether it was water or blood on my face, I didn't care because darkness was suddenly up on me, and I was very, very alone. I needed to get to the flashlight. My priorities were simple as I wrapped my fingers around it and I turned it back on. Find Jared. And I found something else instead. It was banging its head against one of the fish tanks, beating out a dull rhythm till black blood began to trickle down the cracked glass. Nothing but sickly folds of skin with no bone definition. It just sat there, bent and stretched arms tucked to its sides like fins, cysts leaking pus all over boils and old cuts. Slowly it turned to me. Whatever left of its spine creaked in protest as it bent in a way that no human should. I swear my heart stopped at the moment, and I stared through the ragged, salt-bleached hair and stared at the contorted and bloated face of a little girl. Its jaw hung dislocated from its face, the tatters of a familiar dark blue sweatshirt hanging from its slimy maw as it gaped at me stupidly. Jared? I dropped the flashlight, and the thing pounced, knocking me against the ground with a sickening thud. The last thing I saw before my eyes closed was the rippling form of the creature, girl, whatever it was, bite the cover off of the vent and disappear into it with a wet slurp. A few mildly concerned paramedics and an incredibly annoyed boss were hovering over me when I finally awoke. Apparently, I was at fault for delaying the opening of the aquarium, but for some reason I didn't quite seem to care. They found Jared half shoved into one of the water treatment tanks. Miraculously, he was alive. I barely remembered how hard I gripped his arm as we were rolled into the ambulance together. I was babbling, trying to explain what happened, but my words were almost met with sympathetic faces and questions of how hard I hit my head. My boss merely shushed me and whispered the words that I've been hearing since the day that I was hired. Don't worry. We take better precautions now. Those precautions were to fire Jared and me, and stick us with the bill in fixing the cracked tank. Now I'm suspended for the summer, moving inland where dirt and trees replace sand and salt water. Jared and I are keeping in touch, though he hasn't uttered a word since that night. I think that he likes hanging around, so I might bring him along. But I don't sleep anymore. I lie awake at night listening to the sink drip as I imagine the water running through the pipes in the walls. I have nightmares of drowned little girls shoved to the bottom of my water tank and rippling monstrosities dripping down my stairs. And sometimes, I wake up to a puddle of water at the end of my bed. I did a brief stint as a hotel manager right out of high school. And at the time, I wasn't sure that I wanted to go to college. So I drifted a bit and I wound up beached at a hotel where I stayed for about a year. I enjoyed it as much as anyone really could enjoy a retail job, although at times it was catastrophically boring. It certainly wasn't demanding intellectually, and the majority of my work involved herding people, both guests and staff, into the tiny but well-appointed rooms. We were almost always booked to capacity, so we never suffered for lack of a profit. It helped that we had a very well-stacked bar in the dining room, which most of the less expensive hotels didn't offer. Since we were on the richer side of town, we kept a lot of good product in stock, and it was always a point of contention with the staff that they were expressly barred from visiting the bar, even if they were off the clock and out of uniform. The owner of the hotel felt that it was in poor taste to allow the staff to drink at their workplace. This rule held everyone: management, housekeeping, kitchen staff, even the bartenders. Except there was only one exception: Rita. Rita was a small, compact Hispanic woman who spoke almost no English. She was a legend, and every single person in the hotel agreed that this place was held together with her sweat and the bottle of Fabuloso that she carried around in the waistband of her pants. I've never seen a more efficient and more terrifying force of nature than Rita. Watching her clean a room was close to a religious experience. No one could snap a sheet that crispy and lay it perfectly flat in one smooth move, or clean a bathroom with a single paper towel and still leave it spotless like Rita could. Barreling down the hall in her tiny white sneakers, even guests got out of her way without being told to. And pulled along behind her in a wake was the cloying, chemically fruity smell of Fabuloso. Rita worked 10-hour days with unlimited overtime. She was the most senior member of staff and had no set schedule. She came in when she wanted to and left when she wanted. And generally she arrived as soon as the sun was up and left around 7 or 8 at night. No one knew much about her. As I didn't speak Spanish, I couldn't ask much. And I wouldn't even if I could have. Somehow, it wouldn't have been appropriate. All we knew was that every night after she clocked out, she would sit at the bar for hours and drink. She had no preference as far as brand or strength, but according to the bartenders, she generally asked for rum and a healthy slice of lime. Sometimes she would nurse one drink for hours, and other days she would take 3 or 4 before climbing into her car and driving home. I questioned the bartenders whether it was safe for her to drive, and I was assured that Rita never got drunk. Rita could outdrink all of us combined. Now, of course, the glaring question of why Rita could drink and no one else would consumed me at first. But perhaps not surprisingly, no one I asked seemed to know the answer. It had always been that way. One of those things that simply existed and had long since ceased to be of any real interest to anyone. And over time, my curiosity waned, and I went about my job as everyone else did, knowing that at the end of my night, I would wave goodbye to Rita as she sat at the bar, staring at nothing, her very small, chapped hands cupped around the tumbler full of rum. Sometimes she would nod, and sometimes she didn't seem to hear me. When my time at the hotel ended, and my life moved on, I forgot about her. Many years later, however, I happened to run across the owner of the hotel at a restaurant in town. I was visiting an ill family member, and I needed to get out of the house for a bit.
It was late and the owner was sitting at the bar. He invited me to join him, which I did, and we talked for a while, caught up, and asked each other the appropriate questions. He ordered a rum and coke, and that sparked the memory of Rita. And I ordered the same, and I thought that perhaps that he'd be able to solve the mystery for me. He listened to the question, took a large sip, and put his drink down.
Yeah. That. Well, I'm not really sure it's appropriate dinner conversation, frankly.
I assured him that my curiosity was genuine, and that seemed to satisfy him. And so he nodded and stirred his drink with the tip of his finger. I noticed that he wasn't wearing a wedding ring.
Well, you know Rita doesn't speak very much English. When I hired her, she was new to the country. She married the man to get her citizenship, and in any normal circumstance, I had never considered taking her on. There was something about her that I admired. She had this certain resolve. She brought along a friend to translate for her. Now this friend, they kept repeating a certain phrase. I will work for you very hard. I will start tomorrow. Not, may I start tomorrow, it was, I will start tomorrow. And I thought, well, if she's this determined to work for me, why not give her a shot? And of course, you know how hard that woman worked. She was worth every penny that I paid her, and more. I didn't deserve her, frankly. If she would have spoken English, she would have been the perfect employee. He laughed, and I nodded in agreement. So, is that why you let her drink at the bar? Or was the rule not around back then? I prompted, and he shook his head. Oh no, she didn't drink when I hired her. Not at the hotel, anyway. Of course, I can't say what she did outside of it. I knew I could rely on her to do anything and keep the other girls in line. That's why I promoted her to management right away. You know, the other girls were terrified of her. Much as I hate to admit it, fear is an excellent motivator. Nothing bothered her, and she was never afraid to speak her mind. If a guest behaved in a way that she felt was out of line, she'd tell them so. There was no funny business on her watch. She was fearless. And one evening, a man tried to assault her while she was cleaning his room. She sprayed him in the face with her bottle of... what was it that she used? I thought, and it came back to me in a picture. The bottle hanging from her waistband. Fabuloso. Oh, yes, Fabuloso. She had sprayed it in his face. Kicked him in his, well, you know. Called the police right from his room phone. And I gave her a raise after that, thinking that she'd demand one, but she never seemed to let it bother her. Nothing ever did. We ordered another round of drinks and raised an impromptu toast to Rita. He drank deeply, and when he set his glass down, he was frowning, his eyebrows meeting in the middle. One afternoon, it was during the off-season. She'd asked to see me in my office, and it was the only time that I'd ever seen her troubled. I knew whatever was going on was serious, and by that point, she'd picked up a bit of English. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, this man, he's taking a shower too long. It was hard for me to understand her, but I assumed that she meant that someone had left the water on in their room, and I reminded her that it was within policy. She could go in and shut it off. But it was strange, her telling me that. I knew that she knew the policies by heart. I couldn't understand why she was asking me for permission. At least, that's what I thought she was doing. But she kept saying it over and over. He's taking a shower too long of a shower. You must go in. You must call someone. So I had to show me the room where I could hear water running. No one answered the door. So we went inside, and sure enough, someone was in the shower. We could hear him through the door. He wasn't laughing exactly. I can't describe the sound, like hiccuping, I suppose. I told him that I was coming inside, and he didn't answer, and so I went in. and he was in the tub, sitting in it with his clothes on. If I recall correctly, I looked up his reservation after it was over. He was a businessman who was attending a conference. He booked the room for about 5 nights. He was sitting under the water with his suit on, hiccuping. I suspected that he had either suffered from some sort of mental issue or perhaps under the effects of something, and so I had told Rita to use the room phone, call 911. She spoke in Spanish, but I knew I heard her use one of the only Spanish words that I knew. Fuego. And I thought that that was odd. Or maybe that I hadn't heard her correctly. And she seemed so urgent. The whole thing was so strange. While she talked to the dispatcher, I spoke to the guest to try to see what was wrong. And while I was kneeling next to the tub talking to him, I noticed that his shoes were burnt, as well as the cuffs of his shirt. He was picking at him, tearing the fabric off a little. I wondered if that was what Rita had meant. Maybe she had seen him try to light something in the room on fire. I didn't smell any smoke though, so not at that time. The owner downed the rest of his drink and ordered another from the passing bartender. When it arrived, he drank half of it in a few quick swallows. I hadn't touched mine since the toast. It was sweating on the counter. When she came back, I instructed her to go downstairs and wait for the ambulance, but she wouldn't leave. She kept trying to tell me something, but it was in Spanish and I couldn't understand. She would point at him and the hairdryer on the wall, the little lint holes on the side, and then at herself. She held up her hand, wiggling her fingers, gesturing all around, but I couldn't understand her. I knew that there was something wrong, something only that she seemed to be aware of, but I was ashamed to admit it, that I didn't think that it was for anything important. In fact, I was irritated with her. It was so unlike her to disobey me that way. She kept talking and pulling at my sleeve of my coat, trying to pull me away. I got angry and I told her to go downstairs. I swore at her. I am ashamed of such things now. Because she started to cry. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've made her cry, and it upset me, but I just didn't think. I didn't understand. And she wouldn't stop talking, so I got up and I pushed her out. I laid my hands on her and I pushed her out of the room. I shut the door in her face, locked it, and I could hear her pounding on it, yelling something. I told her if she wanted to keep her job, then she'd go downstairs and wait for the police. And I think maybe that she understood that then. That I didn't understand. And that it was pointless for her to try anymore. That what would happen would happen. She was a powerful woman, but against the barrier of language, she was powerless. I heard her leave, and I was alone with the man. He started to talk to me. He told me that he wanted to get out, but that he couldn't. He thanked me, as I recall, quite a few times. And he said, thank you for coming to check on me. It's been awful sitting here, but I couldn't get out to call you. I've been in here for 2 days. Thank you. And of course that was alarming. If he had been in there for 2 days, I imagine that he must have been very hungry, not to mention the other mental implications. And I asked him, why couldn't you get out? I couldn't think of what else to say. And he started laughing and he said, wouldn't believe me even if I told you. The owner stopped and looked into the bottom of his glass. He was right, you know. I wouldn't have believed him. Him or Rita. He shook his head and drained his glass, ordered another and drained it too. I let him.
My hands were numb, but I couldn't let go of the glass. The ambulance got there quickly, though maybe it wasn't that quickly and it only seemed that way. The man didn't say anything else, just sat there under the water. Rita led them upstairs and the paramedics took my place after I opened the door. Rita was right on their heels and she tried to shove past them and tell them whatever she was trying to tell me, but they just shoved her away. I asked us to wait outside and I took her and led her away. She kept looking over her shoulder, but she let me do it. Outside in the hall, we could hear them talking to him, and then him to them. And Rita, poor Rita. She was crying, chewing her knuckles and collapsing on the floor, muttering something, and then got back up. The whole time she kept begging me. I knew that that's what she was doing. Begging. She hung onto my sleeve, pleaded with me, but I just pushed her away. I can't even remember what would have been more important than her. I can't even imagine why I didn't listen. I do remember that I kept thinking of our water bill. Isn't that absurd? I kept thinking of all that wasted water. And all Rita could think about was this man. He was slurring a bit by this point, and I wondered if I should have stopped him from ordering another drink, but it seemed my mouth was shut. And then we heard that water turn off. And the sound of the man climbing out of the shower. I couldn't understand him. The walls and the door were thick, but I could tell that he was upset and resisting it, but the paramedics weren't giving him a choice. And then Rita froze when the water stopped. She was holding my arm too tight. It almost hurt. There was a pause where everything went quiet. That's when I began to feel that something wasn't right. Something felt very wrong. Rita and I looked at each other, and then I knew that I'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. It was too late by then, of course. And then that guilt fell over me. And I ain't never been able to shake it off. I felt myself reaching for the door without even thinking of doing it, and as I did, the door was wrenched open from inside, yanking out of my hand. I felt the rush of air as if the room was taking a very quick, deep breath. And just like that, it was a very strange smell. And a very, very bright orange light. Something hot rushed out. It almost bumped into me, and it was so hot it actually melted the side of my coat. Melted it right off. It was dripping onto the floor. Can you imagine? It all happened so fast. I couldn't make sense of it. I heard Rita scream somewhere during those events. She had gotten out of the way. And I heard the paramedics shouting. One of them pushed me aside, and he got some of the melting coat on his hand, and he didn't seem to notice. He was looking at whatever the bright light was. The light that was now in the hallway. And when he pulled the room's fire extinguisher off the wall, it just clicked into place at once. And I turned and I saw the man completely engulfed in flames. And he was holding Rita in his arms, burning her alive. I grabbed her from him. I guess I sort of kicked. He swung the stool and kicked outward. Kind of like that, you know. Kicked him in the thigh and he let her go. I don't know how, but she wasn't badly burned. Some of her hair was gone and her shirt was been burned mostly away, but I didn't see any blistering on the skin. She was screaming and her eyes were wide, but she was not afraid. She was crying. She reached to the man who was reaching out for her, and he was the only one not making any sound. His mouth was open, and I could see that his tongue was burning. It was actually on fire. But he wasn't making a sound. And I saw the flames. They were coming out from inside him. They were shooting up his throat and out of his mouth. And there was a sweet smell coming from him. Chemical. It was all over for him.
all over for Rita. It was coming from inside of him, baking through his skin with the heat. She cried out a name, reached for the man, and he collapsed on the floor. Then Rita began to go limp, and I caught her, and that second paramedic yanked us both upright and told us to run and call the fire department. I put Rita in the office, laid her on the floor, and instructed the staff to pull the fire alarm and get everyone out of the hotel. And Rita was crying. Even unconscious, she wept. That was the last thing I remember clearly. Everything after that is kind of blurred. He stared at the glittering bottles on the back of the wall of the bar. The bar seemed deafening around us, even though it was mostly empty. When they took the man out, they took him out on a stretcher. They didn't cover him. There wasn't anything to cover, really. Everything had been burned to ash, except for his shoes. His shoes survived. And I wonder about that. About those shoes. We were very quiet for a moment, and then trembling, I pushed my drink away, and suddenly I wanted very much to go back home, back to my temporary bed. Rita started drinking after that, and I let her. And I couldn't think what else to do for her. I couldn't imagine what she must have seen, what she must have felt when that man grabbed her, as if she was a life ring. I remember her hands were hovering over his back. She was trying to hold him, but he was too hot. Then I kicked him away, and he looked at me, and before his eyes melted, I saw that there was fear in them. But more so, a great sadness. I can't remember his name. Perhaps one day I should look it up. And somewhere behind us, someone dropped a glass and it shattered. There was shrill laughter, and I got to my feet quickly. I tossed some cash at the bar and I turned to go, but he grabbed the sleeve of my coat. He looked at me with his hollow face and his dead eyes, and I was sweating inside of my shirt. It never went away, no. That smell. His fingers gripped the fabric. Maybe I could have imagined the whole thing. She always smelled like him, even years later. That smell. It stuck to her. And he let me go. I rushed out into the night towards my car, and I drove home with all the windows down, letting the air roar in. And back at the house, I wound my way up the stairs in the dark. Fully clothed, I climbed into bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, lying awake, drenched in sweat, my palms pressed against my mouth, I thought of Rita. Her chapped, red hands. And the smell of Fabuloso.